The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of St. Peter's Square as security personnel made their final preparations. Today was no ordinary day at the Vatican. King Charles III and Queen Camilla were arriving for what many considered one of the most significant royal visits to the Holy See in decades. The king had been planning this visit for months, ever since his coronation earlier in the year. As the new monarch and supreme governor of the Church of England, his meeting with Pope Francis carried deep symbolic weight. The relationship between the Anglican and Catholic churches had evolved dramatically over the centuries, from bitter division to cautious cooperation, and now to something approaching genuine friendship. Charles stood in his private chambers at the British Embassy in Rome, adjusting his morning coat one final time. The weight of history pressed upon his shoulders. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had visited the Vatican 3 times during her remarkable reign, each visit marking important milestones in interfaith relations. Now, it was his turn to continue that legacy. Camilla emerged from her dressing room, elegant in a black ensemble with a delicate mantilla veil, following the traditional protocol for papal audiences. She had spent weeks learning about Vatican customs and etiquette, understanding that every gesture would be scrutinized by millions watching around the world. The queen consort felt the significance of the moment deeply, knowing that her presence beside Charles represented not just their personal journey together, but the monarchy's commitment to building bridges across faiths. The royal couple's journey to this moment had been anything but conventional. Their love story, which had weathered decades of public scrutiny and personal challenges, had ultimately led them to the throne. Now, as they prepared to meet the spiritual leader of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide, they carried with them the hopes and prayers of their own nation and the broader Commonwealth. Their convoy wound through the narrow streets of Rome, past ancient ruins and bustling piazzas where ordinary Romans paused to catch a glimpse of the British royals. Children waved small Union Jack flags from apartment windows, while elderly women crossed themselves and whispered prayers for the success of the visit. As they approached Vatican City, the world's smallest sovereign state, Charles reflected on the remarkable changes he had witnessed in his lifetime. When he was born, Catholics in Britain still faced significant discrimination. Now, as king, he was visiting the Pope as both a head of state and as a fellow Christian leader committed to dialogue and understanding. The massive walls of Vatican City came into view, their ancient stones having witnessed centuries of papal history. Swiss guards in their colorful uniforms stood at attention as the royal motorcade approached the gates. These same guards had protected popes for over 500 years, their halberds and ceremonial dress unchanged since the Renaissance. Pope Francis had been preparing for this meeting with equal care. Born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Argentina, he had brought a revolutionary spirit to the papacy, emphasizing mercy, environmental stewardship, and dialogue with other faiths. He saw in King Charles a kindred spirit, someone who shared his concerns about climate change and social justice. The Pope had cleared his usually busy schedule for the entire morning, understanding that this meeting represented far more than diplomatic courtesy. The Anglican-Catholic relationship had come so far since the bitter disputes of the Reformation. Now, both churches faced similar challenges in an increasingly secular world, and cooperation seemed not just beneficial but essential. As the royal car passed through the final checkpoint, Camilla reached over and gently squeezed Charles's hand. They had faced so many challenges together, from the early days of their relationship when public opinion was largely against them, to the recent years when they had gradually won the respect and affection of the British people. This visit represented another milestone in their shared journey of service. The car stopped at the entrance to the Apostolic Palace, where a small reception committee waited. Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, stepped forward with a warm smile. Behind him stood Archbishop Paul Gallagher, the Vatican's foreign minister, and several other senior prelates who would play key roles in the day's ceremonies. Charles and Camilla emerged from their vehicle to the sound of the Vatican's bells ringing across Rome. The king wore the Order of the Garter Star on his coat, while Camilla's diamond brooch caught the morning light. They moved with the practiced grace of decades of public service. But there was something special in their bearing today, an awareness that they were participating in a moment of genuine historical importance. The Swiss guards presented arms as the royal couple passed, their movements precise and ceremonial. These guards, recruited from Catholic cantons of Switzerland, had protected the Pope and his residence for centuries. Their presence reminded everyone of the deep traditions and continuity that surrounded this encounter between ancient institutions. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was one of quiet anticipation. Vatican staff had spent days preparing for every aspect of the visit, from the precise positioning of chairs in the papal study to the selection of gifts that would be exchanged. The Pope's personal secretary had briefed him extensively on British royal protocol, while Charles's private secretary had done the same regarding Vatican customs. As they walked through the corridors lined with priceless Renaissance artwork, Charles and Camilla were acutely aware of treading paths walked by countless pilgrims, diplomats, and world leaders throughout the centuries. The very walls seemed to whisper stories of faith, politics, and human drama spanning 2 millennia. Their footsteps echoed softly on the marble floors as they approached the moment that would define their visit. Soon they would stand face to face with Pope Francis, beginning a conversation that would resonate far beyond the walls of the Vatican, touching the lives of millions of Christians around the world and marking a new chapter in the relationship between the British Crown and the Catholic Church. The doors to the papal library opened with barely a whisper, revealing the intimate study where Pope Francis conducted his most important meetings. The room, with its tall windows overlooking St. Peter's Square, had witnessed countless historic encounters. Today, it would host a meeting that both men had looked forward to for months. Pope Francis stood as King Charles and Queen Camilla entered, his weathered face breaking into the genuine smile that had become his trademark. At 86, the Pope moved with the slight stiffness of age, but his eyes sparkled with the energy and warmth that had endeared him to millions worldwide. He wore his simple white cassock, a stark contrast to the ornate surroundings of the papal apartments. Charles stepped forward first, bowing slightly in the traditional manner when meeting the Pope. Francis extended his hand, and Charles kissed the papal ring, following a protocol that stretched back centuries. The gesture, captured by the single photographer allowed in the room, would appear on front pages around the world within hours. Camilla followed, curtsying gracefully before kissing the papal ring. Francis took her hands in his, speaking quietly in English with his distinctive Argentine accent. "Your Majesty," he said to both of them, "welcome to our home. I have been looking forward to this meeting with great joy." The formal greetings completed, the atmosphere immediately relaxed. Francis gestured to 3 chairs arranged around a small table, where he had personally placed a simple wooden crucifix made by refugees in Lebanon. The Pope had a gift for creating intimate spaces even in the grandest settings, and within moments, the vast papal library felt like a comfortable sitting room. Charles began by conveying greetings from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, with whom Francis had developed a close friendship. The 2 religious leaders had worked together on numerous initiatives, from combating modern slavery to addressing climate change. Their collaboration had become a powerful symbol of how former adversaries could become partners in facing contemporary challenges. "Archbishop Welby speaks of you with such affection," Charles said, settling into his chair. "He has told me many times how much your friendship means to him and to all of us in the Anglican Communion." Francis smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Justin is a true man of God. We may wear different robes, but we serve the same Lord. This is what matters most." The Pope's words carried the weight of decades of theological study and pastoral experience, but he delivered them with the simplicity that had characterized his entire papacy. The conversation flowed naturally from personal greetings to weightier matters. Both men shared a deep concern for environmental issues, and Charles found himself describing his decades-long commitment to sustainability and organic farming. Francis listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking pointed questions that revealed his own sophisticated understanding of ecological challenges. When I was young, Charles shared, people thought I was quite mad for talking to my plants and refusing to use chemicals on my gardens at Highgrove. Now those same practices are recognized as essential for our planet's survival. Francis leaned forward, his expression serious. The earth is crying out to us. We who are called to leadership must listen to that cry and act. Our grandchildren will judge us by what we do today, not by what we say tomorrow. Camilla, who had been listening quietly, spoke up about her work with literacy programs and her support for organizations helping victims of domestic violence. Francis had been briefed about her charitable work, but hearing her speak with such passion about helping vulnerable people clearly moved him. The work you do with women who have suffered, Francis said to Camilla, this is the work of Christ. Those who are broken need our special care. The Pope had made support for marginalized people a central theme of his papacy, and he recognized in Camilla a kindred spirit. As their conversation deepened, the historical significance of the moment became even more apparent. Here sat the head of the church that had broken from Rome 500 years ago, speaking as an equal and friend with the Bishop of Rome. The wounds of the Reformation, which had divided families and nations for centuries, had finally begun to heal. Charles spoke movingly about his role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England and his commitment to protecting all faiths in his realm. I have always believed, he said, that I am called to be a defender of faith, not just defender of the faith. In our diverse society, I must protect the space for all people to worship according to their conscience. Francis nodded approvingly. This inclusive vision aligned perfectly with his own approach to interfaith dialogue. Throughout his papacy, he had reached out to Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, and other religious communities, believing that faith communities must work together to address humanity's challenges. The Pope shared his own experiences growing up in Argentina, where Catholic and Protestant communities had learned to coexist and cooperate. In my country, he explained, we discovered that when we work together, we can accomplish so much more than when we work apart. The same is true for our churches. Their discussion turned to the challenges facing Christianity in the modern world. Both men acknowledged the declining church attendance in Western countries and the need for religious institutions to remain relevant to younger generations. They spoke about the importance of demonstrating faith through action, not just words. Young people today, Charles observed, are deeply concerned about justice, about the environment, about inequality. If our churches cannot speak to these concerns, we will lose them. But if we can show that faith leads to action for a better world, then we offer them something precious. Francis had built his entire papacy around this principle. From his first appearance on the papal balcony, when he asked the crowd to pray for him rather than simply blessing them, he had tried to model a different kind of religious leadership. Charles found himself deeply impressed by the Pope's humility and practical wisdom. As the formal part of their meeting drew to a close, both men knew they had forged something special. This was more than diplomatic courtesy or religious protocol. They had discovered a genuine friendship based on shared values and mutual respect. The photographer was called back in to capture the exchange of gifts, a tradition that would mark the formal conclusion of their private audience. But both Charles and Francis knew that the real gift they had exchanged was something far more valuable than any material object. They had given each other hope that ancient divisions could be bridged and that faith communities could work together for the common good. The moment for exchanging gifts had arrived, a tradition that carried deep symbolic meaning in papal audiences. King Charles reached into a specially prepared case and withdrew his first offering, a first edition of John Henry Newman's Apologia pro Vita Sua from 1864. The choice was deeply meaningful. Newman, a former Anglican priest who converted to Catholicism and was later canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, represented the bridge between their two churches. Cardinal Newman, Charles explained as he handed the leather-bound volume to Pope Francis, showed us that intellectual honesty and spiritual searching need not divide us. His journey from Canterbury to Rome was ultimately a journey toward truth. Francis received the book with reverence, running his fingers along the worn leather binding. Newman had been beatified during the pontificate of Pope Benedict XVI and canonized during Francis's own papacy. The saint's writings on conscience and the development of doctrine had influenced Catholic thinking for generations. "This is magnificent," Francis said, opening the book carefully. Newman understood that faith and reason must work together. He reminds us that God speaks to us through our minds as well as our hearts. The Pope's appreciation was genuine. He had studied Newman's writings extensively during his own theological formation in Argentina. Charles then presented a second gift that he had chosen personally, a collection of watercolor paintings he had created of English landscapes, bound in a handcrafted album. The king had been painting for decades, finding in art a form of meditation and spiritual expression. Each painting captured a different season and mood of the English countryside he loved so deeply. "These are places where I have found peace and felt closest to God," Charles explained. "I hope they might bring you some of the same tranquility they have brought me." The paintings showed everything from the gardens at Highgrove to the wild landscapes of Scotland, each rendered with the careful attention to detail that characterized all of Charles's artistic endeavors. Francis studied each painting with the eye of someone who appreciated both art and nature. Having grown up in bustling Buenos Aires, he had always found special meaning in quiet natural settings. "You capture not just the appearance of these places," he told Charles, "but their spirit. This is the gift of a true artist." Camilla then stepped forward with her own offering, an exquisite piece of silverwork created by British artisans, depicting the dove of peace surrounded by olive branches. The piece had been commissioned specifically for this visit, incorporating symbols meaningful to both Christian traditions. "This represents our hope," Camilla said, "that the peace between our churches will continue to grow and flourish." The silver work gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through the library windows, its careful craftsmanship evident in every detail. Pope Francis then presented his gifts to the royal couple. For Charles, he had selected a specially bound copy of his encyclical Laudato Si', his groundbreaking document on care for the environment. But this was not merely any copy. It had been hand-illuminated by Vatican artists in the style of medieval manuscripts, with intricate marginalia depicting the beauty of creation. "This represents my deepest convictions about our responsibility to care for our common home," Francis explained. "I know this cause is close to your heart as well." The Pope had heard of Charles's environmental advocacy going back decades, long before climate change became a mainstream concern. For Camilla, the Pope had chosen a beautiful rosary made from olive wood from the Garden of Gethsemane in Jerusalem, accompanied by a small silver pendant depicting Our Lady of Mercy. The rosary came with a special blessing and a personal note from Francis expressing his admiration for her charitable work. "These olive trees," Francis told Camilla, "have grown in the same soil where our Lord prayed. I hope this rosary will remind you that prayer and action must always go together in service to others." The gift exchange completed, the three moved to another part of the papal library where a more informal conversation could continue. Vatican staff had prepared tea service, understanding that both Charles and Camilla would appreciate this particularly British touch to their visit. As they settled into comfortable chairs, Francis asked about the king's vision for his reign. Charles spoke thoughtfully about his desire to be a unifying figure in an increasingly diverse Britain, about his commitment to interfaith dialogue, and about his hope to use the monarchy's influence to address urgent global challenges like climate change and poverty. "The crown," Charles reflected, "must evolve with the times while preserving what is most valuable from the past. I see my role as bringing people together, not driving them apart." This philosophy resonated deeply with Francis, who had made unity and dialogue central themes of his own leadership. The conversation turned to the challenges facing young people in both their societies. Francis spoke passionately about youth unemployment and the need to give young people hope for the future. Charles shared his experiences with the Prince's Trust, his charity that had helped thousands of disadvantaged young people start businesses and build careers. "We must never give up on the young," Francis said earnestly. "They are not just the future of our churches and our societies. They are our present. Their questions challenge us. Their energy inspires us. Their idealism reminds us of what we should be striving for." Camilla contributed her own observations about working with young people through her literacy programs. She had seen firsthand how education could transform lives and open doors that had seemed permanently closed. "When a child learns to read," she said, "they gain the key to unlimited possibilities. It is one of the most beautiful things to witness." The afternoon light gradually shifted as their conversation continued, touching on everything from the role of women in religious life to the importance of preserving traditional crafts and skills in an increasingly digital world. Both Charles and Francis were deeply committed to honoring the wisdom of the past while embracing necessary change. Francis shared stories from his visits to refugee camps and his work with migrants, describing the resilience and faith he had encountered among some of the world's most vulnerable people. Charles spoke about his own encounters with refugees through his charitable work and his admiration for their courage in rebuilding their lives. "The stranger, the refugee, the person in need," Francis said, "they are not burdens to be borne. They are gifts to be received. They teach us about hope, about determination, about the strength of the human spirit when it trusts in God." As their time together drew to a close, both men understood that something special had occurred. This had been far more than a ceremonial meeting between religious and political leaders. They had found in each other genuine friendship and shared purpose, a recognition that their different roles were united by common values and aspirations. The afternoon sun streamed through the ancient windows of the papal library, casting golden light on a conversation that would be remembered as a turning point in the relationship between the Anglican and Catholic churches. Two men, separated by centuries of theological dispute, have found their way to understanding and mutual respect. Following their private audience, Pope Francis personally escorted King Charles and Queen Camilla through some of the Vatican's most treasured spaces, an honor rarely extended to visiting dignitaries. Their first stop was the Sistine Chapel, where the Pope's own election had taken place just over a decade earlier. As they entered the chapel, all three fell silent in the presence of Michelangelo's magnificent frescoes. The ceiling, depicting scenes from the book of Genesis, stretched above them in all its restored glory. Charles, who had long admired Renaissance art, stood transfixed by the creation of Adam, where God's finger nearly touches that of the first man. "Every time I enter this place," Francis said quietly, "I am reminded of the awesome responsibility we bear as stewards of God's creation." Michelangelo captured something profound about the relationship between the divine and human. Camilla found herself drawn to the altar wall's depiction of the Last Judgment, where Christ sits in majesty while the saved and damned are separated. The artistic power of the scene was overwhelming, but Francis gently directed her attention to the mercy evident even in this scene of divine justice. Michelangelo painted himself among the saved, Francis noted with a slight smile, hidden in the flayed skin of Saint Bartholomew. Even the great artist knew he needed mercy. "We all do." Charles asked about the process of papal elections that took place in this sacred space. Francis described the solemn responsibility of the cardinals who gathered here to choose each new pope and the weight of tradition that surrounded every aspect of the conclave. "When the cardinals elected me," Francis reflected, "I felt the burden of 20 centuries of Christian history settling on my shoulders. But I also felt the prayers of countless believers supporting me. In this room, human decision and divine guidance come together in a mystery we can never fully understand." They moved next to the Vatican museums, where Vatican curator Dr. Barbara Jatta personally guided them through selected galleries. The collection represented one of humanity's greatest artistic treasures, accumulated over centuries of papal patronage and preserved for future generations. In the Gallery of Maps, Charles studied the 16th century cartographic masterpieces that lined the walls. These maps showed the world as Europeans understood it at the height of the Renaissance, including the newly discovered Americas. As king of realms spanning the globe, Charles found particular meaning in these historical perspectives on geography and exploration. These maps remind us that human understanding is always evolving, he observed. What seems certain to one generation appears limited to the next. Humility in the face of truth's complexity is essential for leaders. Francis nodded approvingly. Throughout his papacy, he had emphasized the importance of intellectual humility and openness to learning. The Church, too, must always be willing to learn and grow in understanding. Tradition is not a museum piece. It is a living stream that nourishes each new generation. In the Pinacoteca, they paused before Caravaggio's The Entombment of Christ, one of the most powerful religious paintings ever created. The dramatic chiaroscuro technique showed Christ's lifeless body being lowered into the tomb, surrounded by grieving figures rendered with startling realism. Camilla found herself moved to tears by the raw emotion captured in the painting. The grief of Mary and the other women was palpable, their love for Christ evident in every gesture. Francis noticed her reaction and spoke gently about the role of suffering in Christian understanding. Caravaggio painted from life, Francis explained. These are not idealized figures, but real people experiencing real loss. The incarnation means that God entered fully into human experience, including our suffering and death. Charles reflected on his own experiences of loss, particularly the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, just over a year earlier. Grief is perhaps the most universal human experience, he said. It connects us across all boundaries of faith, nationality, and social class. Their tour continued to St. Peter's Basilica, entering through a side entrance that allowed them to avoid the crowds of tourists and pilgrims. The vastness of the space never failed to impress visitors, but Francis guided them to more intimate corners where the basilica's spiritual significance became most apparent. At Michelangelo's Pieta, they stood in contemplative silence. The sculpture of Mary holding her dead son had moved countless viewers over the centuries with its perfect balance of sorrow and acceptance. The marbles seemed to breathe with life, despite depicting death. When I was a young priest, Francis shared, I would come here whenever I felt overwhelmed by the weight of pastoral responsibility. Mary's expression taught me about surrendering to God's will, even when we cannot understand it. Camilla asked about the significance of Marian devotion in Catholic spirituality. Francis explained that Catholics saw in Mary a model of faith and trust, someone who said yes to God's plan even when it led through suffering to joy. Mary shows us that surrender to God's will is not passive acceptance, Francis said. It is active cooperation with grace, choosing love even when love demands sacrifice. They descended to the Vatican grottos beneath the basilica, where many popes are buried. The atmosphere was quiet and reverent, lit by candles that cast dancing shadows on the ancient walls. Here lay the earthly remains of men who had guided the Catholic Church through centuries of triumph and tribulation. At the tomb of Pope John XXII, Francis paused to say a brief prayer. The beloved Pope who had called the Second Vatican Council was revered by Catholics and non-Catholics alike for his warmth and openness. Charles knew that John XXII's council had helped pave the way for improved relations between Catholics and Anglicans. Good Pope John, Francis said affectionately, taught us that the Church must always be reforming itself, always becoming more faithful to the gospel. His courage to call the council changed everything. They visited the traditional burial place of St. Peter, the first pope, located directly beneath the main altar of the basilica. The simplicity of the memorial contrasted sharply with the grandeur surrounding it, a reminder that the papacy began with a fisherman from Galilee. Peter was so human, Francis reflected. He made mistakes, he denied Christ in his moment of greatest need, he struggled with doubt. Yet Christ chose him to lead the apostles. This gives me hope that God can use even our weaknesses for good. Charles found deep meaning in standing at this spot, the heart of Catholic Christianity. Despite the theological differences that still existed between their churches, he felt the common foundation they shared in apostolic faith. As they prepared to return to the papal apartments, all three knew that this had been more than a tour of art and architecture. They had walked through 2,000 years of Christian history together, finding in that shared heritage a foundation for continued friendship and cooperation. The late afternoon sun streamed through the basilica's windows, casting colored light on the marble floors where millions of pilgrims had knelt in prayer over the centuries. In this ancient space, the future of Christian unity seemed not just possible, but inevitable. As evening approached, King Charles and Queen Camilla found themselves in the papal gardens, one of the most private and peaceful spaces within Vatican City. Pope Francis had insisted on concluding their visit here, away from the formality of official chambers and the weight of artistic masterpieces. Among the carefully tended paths and flowering trees, their conversation could flow naturally and without constraint. The gardens stretched across nearly half of Vatican City's territory, a green oasis in the heart of Rome that few visitors ever see. Ancient cypresses stood sentinel over manicured lawns, while roses and jasmine filled the air with their perfume. Francis walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, clearly at ease in this natural setting. "This is where I come to think and pray," Francis told his guests. Gardens have always been places of encounter with God. Eden was a garden, Gethsemane was a garden, the tomb where Christ rose was in a garden. Charles, who had spent decades creating and tending gardens at his various residences, felt immediately at home among the Vatican's plantings. He asked about the history of different sections, showing a detailed knowledge of horticulture that impressed even the Vatican's head gardener, who had joined them for this portion of the tour. "Gardens teach us patience," Charles reflected, examining a centuries-old olive tree. "We plant knowing that others will enjoy the full beauty of what we begin." There is something deeply hopeful about that act of faith in the future. Camilla paused beside a fountain where water cascaded over carved stone angels. The sound was peaceful and meditative, a gentle counterpoint to their conversation. She spoke about her own love of gardens and how working with soil and plants had helped her through difficult periods in her life. "There is something healing about gardens," she said. "They remind us that beauty can grow from the simplest beginnings, that death and rebirth are part of the natural order, and that care and attention can transform any space." Francis nodded thoughtfully. Throughout his papacy, he had emphasized humanity's responsibility to care for creation, and he saw in both Charles and Camilla kindred spirits who understood that environmental stewardship was not just policy, but spirituality in action. As they walked deeper into the gardens, Francis shared his vision for the future of Christian unity. He spoke about the progress made in recent decades, but acknowledged that much work remained. The goal was not absorption of one church by another, but a unity that preserved diversity while celebrating common faith. "We must be like these gardens," Francis said, gesturing to the variety of plants around them. Different species, different colors, different seasons of blooming, but all drawing from the same soil, all reaching toward the same sun. Charles expressed his commitment to continuing the dialogue between their churches. As Supreme Governor of the Church of England, he understood that his words and actions would influence millions of Anglicans worldwide. The warmth and respect he felt for Francis would translate into practical cooperation in years to come. "Today has shown me that we have far more in common than what separates us," Charles said. "Our young people, especially, need to see that Christians can work together. They face challenges we could never have imagined, and They need the wisdom of faith communities united in purpose. The conversation turned to practical matters of cooperation. Both men envisioned joint initiatives on climate change, poverty reduction, and peace building. Their churches, working together, could amplify their impact on global challenges that required unified responses. Francis spoke about his dream of Christian leaders from all traditions making joint pilgrimages to sites of shared significance. He imagined Anglican and Catholic bishops walking together to Canterbury and Rome, to Jerusalem and Geneva, demonstrating that the journey of faith was stronger when undertaken together. As the sun began to set over Rome, painting the Vatican walls in golden light, the three found themselves at a small shrine within the gardens dedicated to Our Lady of Lourdes. This grotto, a replica of the famous site in France, had been built by Pope Pius IX in 1902 and had become a place of prayer for countless Vatican residents and visitors. Francis invited Charles and Camilla to join him in a moment of silent prayer. Though their traditions had different approaches to Marian devotion, all three found meaning in this request for heavenly intercession for Christian unity. The silence stretched comfortably between them, filled with the sound of flowing water and rustling leaves. When they opened their eyes, Francis reached into his cassock and withdrew a small wooden cross, carved from olive wood from the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. He pressed it into Charles's hands with evident emotion. "This is my personal gift to you," Francis said quietly. "Not as Pope to King, but as one Christian to another. May it remind you that the cross, which once divided our churches, now unites us in hope." Charles accepted the cross with deep gratitude, understanding the personal significance of the gesture. This simple piece of wood, from the place where Christ prayed before his crucifixion, would become one of his most treasured possessions. Their formal farewell took place in the courtyard of San Damaso, where the papal apartments looked down on the gathering dusk. Swiss guards stood at attention as the royal couple prepared to depart, but the ceremony felt more like friends parting than a diplomatic conclusion. Francis embraced both Charles and Camilla warmly, European style, then blessed their journey home. "Go in peace," he said, using the traditional words that concluded every Catholic Mass, "and may God bless your service to your people." As their convoy wound through the Vatican gates and into the Roman evening, Charles and Camilla reflected on a day that had exceeded all their expectations. They had come as representatives of their nation and church, but they departed as friends who had found common cause with the Bishop of Rome. The impact of their visit would extend far beyond their personal experience. News reports around the world highlighted the warmth and mutual respect displayed throughout the day. Images of the Protestant King of England and the Catholic Pope in animated conversation would help millions of ordinary believers see possibilities for unity they had never imagined. In Anglican parishes across Britain and the Commonwealth, priests would speak in coming weeks about the visit's significance for Christian unity. In Catholic churches around the world, Pope Francis's evident affection for the British royals would help heal wounds that had festered for centuries. As their plane lifted off from Rome's airport, carrying them back to London, Charles gazed out at the lights of the eternal city spreading below. Somewhere among those lights was Vatican City, where a pope from Argentina was probably saying his evening prayers, perhaps remembering their day together with the same sense of hope and possibility. The ancient divisions between their churches had not disappeared in a single day, but something important had shifted. Two institutions that had once viewed each other with suspicion and hostility had found a way to friendship and cooperation. In an increasingly divided world, their example offered a powerful witness to the possibility of unity without uniformity, of peace built on mutual respect rather than mutual surrender. The royal couple Vatican visit would be remembered not as a diplomatic formality, but as a turning point in Christian history, a day when the healing of ancient wounds took a great step forward and the future of faith communities looked brighter than it had in centuries.